My cousin walked up to me at the family BBQ and asked, "Why are you wearing white after Labor Day?" I laughed. "Since when do you care about fashion rules?" My cousin Paul didn't laugh back. His face went pale and he kept glancing around like he was looking for backup. Before I could ask what his problem was, Aunt Paige practically sprinted across the yard and wrapped me in the tightest hug I'd ever received. "Not this. Not today," she whispered into my hair, her voice trembling. Over her shoulder, I could see Uncle Ted pulling out his phone with trembling hands. My grandmother had stopped mid-conversation with the neighbors and sank into a lawn chair, wiping her tears away. "Aunt Paige, you're scaring me." I tried to pull away, but she held on tighter, like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. That's when I noticed everyone staring. My cousin Sienna, who never missed a chance to make snide comments about my appearance, had tears streaming down her face. Her brother Jake was approaching with a full plate of food, his hands visibly shaking. "You should eat something," Jake said softly. "I just ate 20 minutes ago." My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Will someone please tell me what's going on?" My mother materialized at my side, her eyes giving away her panic. "Let's go inside and find you something else to wear, honey." "Mom, it's a barbecue. I'm not changing clothes. Please." Her voice cracked. "We need to talk." My cousin Amy positioned herself between me and the pool, trying to look casual but clearly blocking my path. "Are you feeling okay? Like, really okay? You're not sad or anything?" The entire family seemed to be slowly surrounding me, creating a human barrier between me and any water. Even the coolers full of ice had been mysteriously moved to the far side of the yard. It all made my head spin. I reached for the picnic table to steady myself and instantly had 6 relatives at my side. Someone said, "She's not well," and another voice added, "I knew this would happen." Dr. Mabu, my mother's friend who'd been invited to the BBQ, appeared with her medical bag. "Let me check your vitals, sweetheart." She was already wrapping a blood pressure cuff around my arm while everyone watched anxiously. "I'm fine. I just got dizzy because everyone's acting insane. I think we should go to the hospital," Dr. Mabu announced after checking my pupils, just to be safe. "The hospital? For wearing white?" But no one responded. Instead, they practically shoved me towards her car. Dr. Mabu spoke quietly to the triage nurse who took one look at our group and immediately led us back. They ran blood tests, monitored my heart, asked dozens of questions about my mental state. A psychiatrist I'd never met entered with a gentle smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Dr. Black. I understand you've been under some stress. Have you had any thoughts of hurting yourself?" "What? Number? Why would you even ask that?" "Sometimes trauma anniversaries can trigger unexpected reactions," a nurse added while adjusting an IV I didn't even need. "Any recent anxiety around water? Swimming pools, beaches, boats?" That's when my mother burst through the door. Her face was already streaked with tears and she looked at me with an expression of pure terror. "Take it off," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, baby, just take off the white dress." "Mom, you're scaring me. What is this about?" She collapsed into the chair beside my bed and took my hands in hers. They were ice cold and shaking. 40 years ago, my sister Greta drowned at our family Labor Day picnic. She was 6 years old, wearing her favorite white dress, the one she'd gotten for her birthday. I'd never heard of an Aunt Greta. I was 8. I was supposed to be watching her, but I got distracted playing with my cousins. She wanted to show everyone her pretty white dress. Those were her last words before she ran toward the dock. The room had gone completely silent except for the hum of medical equipment. Then Uncle James, 5 years later, wore a white suit to a September wedding. His boat capsized that weekend. Then, she couldn't continue. Then what? But somehow I already knew. Then there was your brother Igor. He was 8 years old, the same age I was when Greta died. He wore white swim trunks to a pool party in September. I gasped. We never talked about how Igor died, just that it was a drowning accident when I was 2. "Mom, those are coincidences. Tragic, horrible coincidences. You knew how this would affect me." She was sobbing now. "You knew I can't handle seeing white after Labor Day. Greta drowned because you failed her, not because of a dress." This time she didn't get to reply. No one did, because I stormed out. And even though I felt like a badass, it was still really hard. So I spent the entire night bawling my eyes out. And when I woke up, I noticed my phone had been bombarded with dozens of texts and missed calls. By the 10th, they were practically threatening me. I scrolled through and saw 23 more texts had come in while I slept. Some were saying sorry for overreacting, but most were angry or begging me to call back. My cousin texted that I was selfish and didn't understand what I'd put Mom through. Another aunt wrote that I should be ashamed of myself for hurting the family like this. The worst ones actually scared me though. One uncle said I'd regret this, and another wrote that I needed to be taught a lesson about respect. My hands shook as I took screenshots of those messages just in case I needed them later. I couldn't deal with any of this right now because I had to get to work in an hour. I dragged myself out of bed and into the shower where I stood under the hot water trying to wake up. My eyes were puffy and red from crying, and I'd only gotten maybe 2 hours of actual sleep. I threw on whatever clothes were clean and drove to the office on autopilot. The second I walked in, my coworker looked up from her computer and her face changed. She asked if I was okay because I looked really bad. I mumbled something about family stuff being complicated right now. She brought me coffee without me asking, which was nice of her. Then my boss walked by and did a double take when she saw me. She motioned for me to follow her to her office and closed the door behind us. She said Mom had called the office this morning asking them to check if I was having some kind of breakdown. My face burned with embarrassment as she explained that Mom sounded really worried and kept saying I wasn't thinking clearly. My boss sat down and asked if I wanted to talk about what was going on. I told her the basic version without all the weird parts about my family thinking white clothes caused drowning. I just said they had some trauma around water accidents and they overreacted when I wore something that reminded them of it. She nodded and said, "Grief makes people do strange things sometimes." She suggested I take the rest of the day to sort things out and mentioned the company had an employee assistance program if I needed to talk to someone professional. I accepted both offers immediately because I could barely focus anyway and didn't want anyone else to see me like this. Back at my apartment, I sat on my couch and kept thinking about everything that happened at the hospital. The way Dr. Mabu had whispered to that nurse and how fast they took me back like I was actually dying. How that psychiatrist kept asking about suicide even when I said over and over that I was fine. The nurse adjusting an IV I didn't need while asking about water and trauma anniversaries. It made me so mad that wearing a white dress after some arbitrary date turned into them treating me like I was having a mental health crisis. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Paul's number. He'd looked more shocked than angry at the barbecue, so maybe he'd actually talk to me. I texted asking if he could meet for coffee tomorrow without telling anyone else in the family. He texted back pretty quick saying yes, but he wanted to bring his girlfriend for support if that was okay. I said sure because I just needed someone to help me understand what was really happening with our family. That evening I was heating up leftover pizza when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I peeked through the blinds and saw Uncle Ted's SUV sitting there there with him and Aunt Paige inside. They were clearly arguing about something and kept looking at my front door. I turned off all the lights and ducked down so they couldn't see me through the windows. My heart pounded as I waited for them to knock, but they just sat there. I watched through a crack in the blinds as they stayed in my driveway for 40 whole minutes before finally backing out and driving away. I realized I was actually scared of my own family now, which felt completely insane. The next morning, I called the employee assistance number my boss had given me. The woman who answered was really nice and asked basic questions about what kind of help I needed. I found myself explaining about the family deaths and how everyone thought wearing white after Labor Day was dangerous. She didn't laugh or act like I was crazy, which I appreciated. She said she could schedule me with someone who specialized in family trauma and grief. The appointment was for Thursday afternoon, which gave me a few days to figure out what I even wanted to say. When Thursday came, I drove to the therapist's office feeling nervous about talking to a stranger about all this. The therapist was younger than I expected, with a calm voice that made me feel less anxious. She asked what brought me in, and I told her everything from the barbecue to the hospital to my family acting like I'd committed some terrible crime. She helped me figure out what I actually wanted, which was to understand the real story behind these deaths and to set boundaries with my family. She gave me homework to write down everything I knew about each drowning without judging whether it made sense or not. So the family's treating white clothes after Labor Day like some kind of deadly curse? I'm really curious why they waited until she was already wearing the dress to completely panic. Wouldn't they have mentioned this supposed pattern before if 3 family members actually drowned? We talked about ways to handle the family pressure while I tried to figure out what was really going on. That weekend I went to the library and asked the librarian how to find old newspaper articles from 40 years ago. She showed me the microfilm machines and helped me find the right dates. My hands shook as I scrolled through until I found it. A small article about a 6-year-old girl drowning at Pine Lake during a family gathering. The details were really basic, just saying she wandered away from the adults and was found too late. Nothing about what she was wearing or any kind of curse. I printed out the article and sat there staring at it for a long time. Monday morning, I finally worked up the nerve to call my grandmother. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding tired. I asked if we could talk about Aunt Greta since I'd just learned about her. The second I said Greta's name, she started crying, and then the line went dead. She'd hung up on me. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom saying I was cruel for tormenting an old woman with painful memories, and that I should be ashamed of myself. I threw my phone on the couch and tried to ignore the guilt creeping in, but then it buzzed again with a voicemail notification from Uncle Ted. His voice sounded tired when I played it back, and he started by saying sorry for sitting in my driveway that night. He explained he just wanted to make sure I was okay without bothering me, and mentioned Mom hadn't slept since Labor Day. He said the whole family was worried about both of us, and his voice cracked a little at the end, which made me feel bad about avoiding him. The next day at work, I caught Rita during lunch break and asked if she'd help me research what really happened with the drownings. She didn't even hesitate before saying yes, and mentioned her sister worked at the courthouse so she could check court records too. Having someone who wasn't family willing to help felt like a huge relief after all the crazy reactions I'd been getting. We met at the library that Saturday, and Rita showed me how to use the microfilm machines to find old newspapers. My hands shook as I scrolled through September issues from 40 years ago until I found it. The article about Greta's death had a black and white photo of Pine Lake with police boats searching the water. The headline asked why children were allowed near the dock during severe weather warnings that had been issued that morning. Rita pointed at the date, and we looked up weather records from that day on the library computer. The National Weather Service archives showed thunderstorm warnings and dangerous wind conditions for the entire county. We kept digging and found the article about Igor from 23 years ago, which mentioned flash flood warnings in effect when he drowned. Then we tracked down Uncle James's boat accident from 35 years ago and discovered it happened during what meteorologists later called a microburst with winds over 60 miles per hour. Every single drowning happened during dangerous weather that should have kept people away from water. Rita spread out all the printed articles on the table and pointed at something I hadn't noticed before. None of the newspaper reports mentioned what anyone was wearing that day. The articles talked about weather conditions and lack of supervision and safety failures, but nothing about clothing colors. The white clothing story only existed in my family's version of events. A week later, the hospital bill showed up in my mailbox, and I nearly screamed when I saw the total. $3,000 after insurance for blood tests and monitoring and a psychiatric evaluation I never needed. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the itemized charges for things like crisis intervention and mental health assessment. Part of me wanted to drive straight to Mom's house and throw the bill in her face. Instead, I called my insurance company and started the appeals process while explaining how my family forced me into unnecessary treatment. The woman on the phone sounded sympathetic and said they'd review the claim, but it could take several weeks. Thursday's therapy appointment came around, and the therapist asked me to write down any memories I had of Igor's death. I was only 2 when it happened, but as I wrote, I remembered the heavy feeling in our house afterward. Mom put locks on every door that led outside and made rules about never going near water. The therapist helped me see how the white clothing rule gave my family something to control when they couldn't control accidents. She said it was easier to blame clothing than accept that supervision failed or weather was ignored. That night, Mom left me a voicemail that went on for 12 minutes according to my phone. I couldn't handle hearing her voice, so I used an app to transcribe it instead. She rambled about protecting me and how the curse was real, and she couldn't lose another person she loved. Mixed in were accusations that I was trying to kill myself to punish her for being a bad mother. The transcript showed how messed up her thinking had become when she said I wore white on purpose to hurt her. Rita came over the next day with her laptop and showed me a spreadsheet she'd made comparing newspaper facts to family stories. Each death had clear safety failures like no life jackets or ignoring weather warnings or lack of adult supervision. She pointed out that accepting those failures meant accepting responsibility, which was probably harder than blaming clothes. The pattern was obvious when you looked at facts instead of superstition. I spent the next few days tracking down people who might remember Greta's drowning and finally found a name in an old article. Archie Abbott had been quoted as a witness who tried to help with the rescue attempt. The phone book still had an A. Abbott listed at an address not far from Pine Lake. I drove there on Saturday morning and knocked on the door of a small house with an overgrown garden. An elderly man answered, and I explained who I was and why I needed to understand what really happened that day. He looked hesitant at first, but when I said I was trying to help my family heal, he was invited me inside. His living room had old photos on every surface, and he pointed to one showing a younger version of himself at the lake. He said he remembered that Labor Day clearly because it was such a tragedy for the whole community. He'd been fishing from the dock when he heard screaming and saw adults running toward the water. According to him, the weather had been terrible all morning with warnings on the radio telling people to stay away from lakes. The wind had been so bad that morning that several families left early, but ours stayed because the adults wanted to keep drinking beer and playing cards. Archie shifted in his chair and pulled out an old photo album from the coffee table drawer, flipping to a page with yellowed newspaper clippings. He pointed to a picture showing the dock that day with waves crashing against it hard enough to spray water 20 feet inland. Not a single kid in the photo had a life jacket on, even though they were all running around near the water. He told me nobody at that picnic knew how to swim, except for a couple of the adults who were too drunk to notice when Greta wandered off. The parents had set up their card table facing away from the water so they could focus on their game without distractions. There wasn't any designated person watching the kids, just the assumption that someone would notice if something went wrong. Archie said he remembered your mom was playing tag with the other kids when Greta decided to go look at the fish by the dock. Nobody saw her slip on the wet wood or heard her hit the water over the wind. By the time someone noticed she was missing and they started searching, she'd been under for at least 10 minutes. The white dress had nothing to do with it except making her easier to spot when they finally found her floating face down. I thanked Archie for telling me the truth and drove home feeling sick about how preventable it all was. The next morning, I called the hospital records department and requested my files from the Labor Day incident. The woman on the phone said it would take 3 to 5 business days to process, and I could pick them up in person with ID. While waiting, I decided to look into Uncle James's death too, since Mom had connected it to the white clothing thing. I found his obituary online from 15 years ago, mentioning he'd been celebrating a promotion with friends on a boat when the accident happened. The article used careful language but mentioned the Coast Guard was investigating whether alcohol played a role. I filled out a Freedom of Information request form on the Coast Guard website asking for their report on the accident. 3 days later, the hospital called saying my records were ready. I drove over and signed the release forms, then sat in my car reading through 20 pages of notes. Right there on page 1, it said, "Patient denies suicidal ideation, appears oriented and calm, family members insisting on evaluation based on clothing choice," and date. The psychiatrist's notes were even clearer, stating I showed no signs of depression or self-harm risk, and appeared confused by the family's reaction. I made copies at the library and forwarded everything to my therapist, keeping the originals in a folder at home. 2 weeks passed before an envelope from the Coast Guard arrived with Uncle James's accident report. I spread the pages across my kitchen table and read through every detail. The boat had been carrying 8 people when it was rated for 6 maximum. Nobody on board wore life jackets even though the rental agreement required them. Blood alcohol tests showed the operator was 3 times the legal limit. The weather service had issued small craft warnings that morning due to 6-foot swells and 20-knot winds, but the group went out anyway. The family's been passing down weather denial like it's a treasured heirloom while blaming laundry choices for their terrible decision-making skills. That's some creative accounting worthy of a tax evader's imagination. Page 4 had witness statements from other boaters who saw them doing dangerous maneuvers and ignoring safety flags. Uncle James wearing white to a wedding the week before had zero connection to him drowning during a drunk boat party, where every safety rule were ignored. I stacked all my evidence into a neat pile and picked up my phone to call Mom. My hands shook as I dialed, but I knew I had to do this. She answered on the second ring, sounding tired. I told her I had proof the white clothing rule wasn't real, and started explaining about the weather warnings and lack of supervision. She cut me off screaming that I was dishonoring the dead and trying to destroy our family's memory of them. I stayed calm and said the real dishonor was using superstition instead of teaching water safety. She called me heartless and said I'd killed them all over again by digging this up. When she started sobbing about how I wanted her to suffer, I told her I loved her but couldn't listen to this anymore, and hung up. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing with notifications from the family group chat. Mom had posted that I was spreading lies about our family tragedies and trying to erase the memories of Greta, James, and Igor. Some relatives immediately took her side, calling me cruel and disrespectful. But then Amy posted that maybe it was time to talk about this openly. Jake agreed, saying he'd always wondered if there was more to the story. Paul added that the clothing rule had caused unnecessary fear for years. The chat exploded into arguments with people taking sides and accusations flying back and forth. Amy texted me privately saying she was proud of me for speaking up and that she'd suspected the truth for years but never had the courage to say anything. More relatives started private messaging me, some angry but others thanking me for finally addressing what they'd been thinking. The family was splitting into camps, but at least people were talking about it instead of blindly following the superstition. Thursday's therapy appointment couldn't come fast enough. The therapist had me practice scripts for setting boundaries with family members who refused to accept the truth. We went through different scenarios where relatives might attack or guilt me, and worked on calm responses that didn't escalate things. She reminded me I couldn't control their reactions, only my own responses to them. We spent time discussing how to maintain relationships with family members who were open to change while protecting myself from those who weren't ready. She suggested I focus on the relatives who'd reached out supportively and give the others space to process. The next week, she recommended I try a grief support group to hear how other families dealt with trauma. I was nervous walking into the community center, but the group leader made everyone feel welcome. As people shared their stories, I heard pattern after pattern of families creating rigid rules after losses. One woman's family had banned swimming entirely after her uncle drowned, making the kids terrified of even bathtubs. Another man talked about how his family stopped celebrating birthdays after his sister died at a party, turning every birthday into a day of mourning instead. A couple described how their relatives wouldn't drive on highways after a car accident, adding hours to every trip. The group leader explained these rules gave families an illusion of control over random tragedies. Hearing others describe similar situations made me feel less alone in dealing with my family's dysfunction. Meanwhile, Rita's sister had been searching court records and found something huge about Igor's death. She handed me a manila folder with copies of a civil settlement between my parents and the pool owner's insurance company. The documents showed the pool had no fence around it, no shallow end markers, and the teenage lifeguard had been texting instead of watching swimmers. My parents had received a $100,000 settlement 8 years ago, but never told me about it. The papers proved there was clear negligence that caused Igor's death, not some curse about white swim trunks. That afternoon, a handwritten envelope arrived from grandmother with no return address. Inside was a short note in her shaky handwriting saying she couldn't talk about Greta, but understood I needed answers. She'd included an old photo from that Labor Day, and my heart stopped when I saw it. Greta was wearing a white dress with pink flowers all over it, not the solid white dress the family story always described. The photo made my hands shake so bad I dropped it on the kitchen table. I grabbed my phone and took a picture of it before shoving the original back in the envelope. Monday morning came too fast, and I dragged myself to work feeling like garbage. My coworker took one look at me and asked if I was okay, but I just mumbled something about family stuff. 10 minutes later, my boss called me into her office. She closed the door behind me and sat down with this worried look on her face. case. Mom had been calling the office every day since the barbecue, sometimes 3 or 4 times, asking them to check if I was suicidal or having a breakdown. The receptionist had started screening her calls, but she kept calling from different numbers. My boss pushed a box of tissues across the desk, even though I wasn't crying yet. She said HR wanted documentation that I was mentally stable or they'd have to put me on leave. I pulled out my phone and showed her the text from my therapist confirming our appointments and that I wasn't in any crisis. She made copies of everything and said HR would block Mom's number from the main line. Then she offered to adjust my schedule so I could make my therapy appointments without using sick time. I thanked her and went back to my desk where I spent the rest of the day staring at spreadsheets without really seeing them. Thursday's therapy appointment came around and my therapist had this new idea. She said the hospital incident had created a fear of water I never had before. Every time I walked past the office water cooler, I'd tense up and I'd been avoiding the bathroom at work because the sound of toilets flushing made me anxious. She wanted to start small with exposure therapy. That afternoon, she walked me to the park across from her office where this big fountain shot water 10 feet in the air. We sat on a bench 20 feet away while I did breathing exercises. My whole body wanted to run, but I forced myself to stay put. She had me move 5 feet closer every few minutes until I was sitting right at the edge with mist hitting my face. It felt stupid, but also like I was taking something back from my family's craziness. The next week, she had me put my hand in the fountain water while counting to 30. Then we went to the community pool, and I sat in the bleachers watching kids take swimming lessons. By the third week, I could stand at the pool edge without my heart racing. Rita had been amazing through all of this, checking on me every day and bringing me dinner when I forgot to eat. One Saturday, she offered to drive me somewhere I'd been thinking about. Pine Lake was 40 minutes outside town, and neither of us talked much on the drive. The parking lot was mostly empty since summer was over. We walked down to the dock where it happened, and I could see exactly how a little kid could fall in. No fence, no rope, nothing between the wooden boards and deep water. The dock was maybe 3 feet wide with gaps between the planks where small feet could slip through. I stood there for 20 minutes just looking at the water and thinking about this aunt I never knew existed. Rita stayed quiet beside me, just being there. I whispered goodbye to Greta and promised I'd help the family heal the right way. On the drive home, Rita mentioned she'd been digitizing old family photos her mom had in storage. She'd found a whole album from that Labor Day 40 years ago. Her mom had been friends with my grandmother and took pictures at all the family events. She'd email them to me when she got home. That night, I opened Rita's email and found 15 photos from that day. Most showed adults drinking beer and kids running around with hot dogs, but there was one of Greta from earlier in the day, maybe around noon based on the shadows. She was wearing blue shorts and a striped shirt, standing by the picnic table with a paper plate. The white dress with pink flowers must have come later. Another photo from what looked like mid-afternoon showed her in the same blue shorts playing with other kids. She'd definitely changed clothes at some point, which meant the whole story about wanting to show off her white dress all day was completely made up. My anger started melting into something else. Mom had been 8 years old watching her baby sister, probably told to keep an eye on her while adults partied. Then Greta drowned, and Mom spent 40 years blaming herself. The white clothing rule wasn't about preventing drownings, it was about having some control over chaos. If she could just keep everyone from wearing white after Labor Day, maybe no one else would die. It was magical thinking from a traumatized child who never got proper help. Understanding this didn't make what she did to me okay, but it made it make sense. I spent the next 3 days at the library pulling weather service records on microfiche. September 3rd, 40 years ago, had severe thunderstorm warnings all day with winds up to 50 miles per hour. The newspaper even ran a story the day before warning people to stay away from lakes and rivers. Uncle James died during what they called a 100-year storm, with waterspouts reported on the lake. Igor's death happened during flash flood conditions that killed 3 other people that same weekend. I typed everything into a spreadsheet with dates, weather conditions, and warning levels. Every single drowning happened when authorities were literally telling people to stay out of the water. I'm trying to understand how the narrator figured out the weather connection. Did they just randomly think to check old weather reports? The way they're organizing everything in spreadsheets shows such a different approach than their mom's emotional reactions. I made a simple chart showing the pattern and attached all the weather service documentation. Then I spent an hour writing an email to Paul, Amy, and Jake with just the facts. No emotional commentary. Maybe seeing the data would help them understand. I started working on something else too. A family safety memo about water activities with actual useful information. Things like everyone should know how to swim, life jackets aren't optional for kids, never swim alone, check weather reports, and assign a sober adult to watch swimmers. I framed it as honoring Greta, James, and Igor by preventing future tragedies through real precautions instead of superstition. It took me all weekend to get the wording right. I wanted it to be helpful, not preachy. Monday morning, I was reviewing the memo one more time when my phone buzzed. Mom had texted me a wall of text that I had to read 3 times to understand through all the typos and rage. She'd heard about my weather research from someone, probably grandmother. She said if I sent my lies to one more family member, she'd cut me out of her life completely. She'd change her will, block me on everything, and tell everyone I was dead to her. The words stung more than I expected. I typed back that I loved her, and my door would always be open when she was ready to get help. Then I blocked her number because I couldn't handle the constant attacks anymore. I needed space to heal without her voice in my head. I sent the safety memo to Paul first, since he'd been the most reasonable. He texted back within an hour saying it all made sense and he'd been thinking the same things. Amy responded that afternoon, agreeing to help promote real safety measures at family events. Jake called that evening, and we talked for an hour about how scared he'd been at every family gathering near water, always checking what people were wearing instead of watching for actual dangers. Paul admitted he'd thought the white clothing rule was weird since he was a kid, but was too scared to say anything. His mom had slapped him once for questioning it when he was 12. We agreed to be the change the family needed. The next morning, my phone rang while I was getting ready for work. The caller ID showed Sienna, and I almost didn't answer. She never called me. Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow. She apologized for all the comments she'd made over the years about my clothes. Every September, she'd panic about what everyone was wearing and take it out on me when I didn't seem to care enough. She'd been terrified of water since she was 5 because of the family stories. She couldn't even take baths, only showers, and hadn't been swimming since she was a kid. Then she asked if maybe we could take swimming lessons together. She wanted to face her fear, but was too scared to do it alone. I was so shocked I just stood there holding the phone. Sienna had made my life miserable at family gatherings for years, and now she wanted to be swimming buddies. But something in her voice sounded real and broken and tired of being afraid. I told her yes. We set up our first swimming lesson for the following Saturday, and I texted Paul and Amy about meeting at the coffee shop near the community center afterward. Jake showed up too, bringing his girlfriend who'd been watching our family drama unfold from the outside. agreed. The five of us grabbed a corner table and Paul pulled out a notebook, saying we needed to get organized about making real changes. Amy suggested we rotate who watches the water areas at family events, not to check clothes but to actually watch for safety. Jake's girlfriend offered to make laminated cards with drowning signs, since most people don't know what real drowning looks like. We agreed to each take responsibility for different safety measures at gatherings, with Paul handling weather monitoring, Amy managing life jackets, and Jake ensuring sober supervision. It felt weird planning family events without half the family, but at least we were doing something productive. Jake stirred his coffee and mentioned something that shocked me. He said Uncle Ted's brother had been questioning the white clothing thing for years, but gave up trying to convince anyone. Apparently, the brother had brought research about water safety to a family meeting 10 years ago and got shouted down so badly he moved to Oregon. Jake's girlfriend added that her mom went to the school with Uncle James and remembered him as a heavy drinker who took stupid risks all the time. Paul nodded and said at least 6 other relatives had privately expressed doubts over the years, but were too scared of Mom and Aunt Paige to speak up. Even Uncle Ted himself had once suggested swimming lessons for all the kids, but got shut down because the family thought avoiding white clothes was enough protection. 3 days later, I was picking out cereal at the grocery store when Aunt Paige appeared at the end of my aisle. She marched straight at me, her face red and her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She yelled that I was destroying our family and spitting on the graves of innocent children. I kept my voice calm and told her that teaching kids to swim honors the dead more than checking their outfit colors. She called me heartless and said I'd cursed us all. Other shoppers stopped to stare, some pulling out phones, but I just stood there holding my cereal box. I told her that Greta drowned because no one was watching her, not because of her dress. She raised her hand like she might slap me, then seemed to remember we were in public and stormed off instead, knocking over a display of crackers on her way out. My therapy appointment that week focused on preparing for eventual contact with Mom. The therapist had me sit in different chairs to play both parts of a future conversation. As Mom, I had to voice her fears and anger, which helped me understand her perspective better. As myself, I practiced staying calm while expressing my boundaries and explaining that I still loved her despite our conflict. We went through different scenarios, like what if she cries, what if she yells, what if she threatens to hurt herself. The therapist reminded me that I couldn't control Mom's reactions, only my own responses. We spent the last 20 minutes discussing my grief for the mother-daughter relationship we might never have if she couldn't move past the superstition. I realized I was mourning something that might never exist. After therapy, I met Paul and his girlfriend at a sandwich shop. She worked as a social worker specializing in family trauma and offered to help if Mom ever wanted professional mediation. She explained how she'd helped other families work through similar situations where tragedy created rigid beliefs. Paul mentioned his girlfriend had experience with families where grief turned into destructive patterns that got passed down through generations. She gave me her card and said to call anytime, even just to talk. I thanked her but didn't feel hopeful Mom would ever agree to mediation. That weekend, I started a project I'd been thinking about since finding those old photos. I bought a nice album and began collecting pictures of Greta, Uncle James, and Igor that showed their lives, not their deaths. I found Greta's kindergarten photo in grandmother's old albums she'd lent me before the blow-up. Uncle James appeared in tons of family pictures, usually laughing or playing guitar. Igor's baby pictures made me cry, but I included them anyway. I wrote little facts under each photo, like Greta loved butterflies, James played in a band, Igor's first word was dog. At my next therapy session, I brought the album to show my therapist. She flipped through it slowly, noting how I'd humanized them beyond their tragic ends. We discussed when might be the right time to share it with Mom, maybe when she was further along in her own therapy. The therapist pointed out the photo showing Greta in different clothes earlier that day, agreeing it could help break through the false narrative Mom had built. We decided I should keep adding to it, making it a celebration of their lives. Time moved weird after that, some days dragging and others flying by. 3 months after Labor Day, just when I'd started to accept Mom might never come around, my phone buzzed with her name. The text was long and rambling, full of typos, saying she'd been having nightmares and panic attacks that were getting worse. Her doctor had prescribed anxiety medication, but said she needed therapy to address the root cause. She wanted to meet, but only with Paul's girlfriend there as mediator. My hands shook as I typed back yes, giving her the mediator's contact information. The support group I'd been attending had become a real source of comfort, and the leader pulled me aside after one meeting. She ran workshops on complicated grief and family myths, and wondered if I'd share my story at the next one. She thought hearing from someone currently going through it might help others more than professional presentations. I agreed, seeing it as practice for explaining things to my own family if they ever wanted to listen. I spent 2 weeks preparing my presentation, organizing everything that had happened into something coherent. Swimming lessons with Sienna had become the highlight of my week, both of us terrible, but improving. During our 10th lesson, while practicing backstroke, she suggested we plan a proper memorial for Greta, James, and Igor. Not a sad event, but something productive, maybe by the water, but with safety demonstrations and life jacket donations to local families who couldn't afford them. We could honor them by preventing future drownings through education and resources. The idea felt right, like we were finally channeling our family's fear into something useful. I started researching water safety organizations we could partner with. 2 days later, a package arrived with no return address, though I recognized grandmother's handwriting. Interesting conversation happening here. I wonder what they're really thinking. Inside was a small jewelry box containing an old locket with Greta's photo, the metal worn smooth from years of handling. Her note said she was too old and tired to change her beliefs, but understood I was trying to help our family heal. She asked me to remember Greta as the happy little girl who loved butterflies and dancing, not as the cautionary tale she'd become. The last line made me cry when she wrote that maybe I was brave enough to save our family from itself. The next week, Sienna called asking if I wanted to help plan a memorial for Greta, James, and Igor at the community pool. I drove over to her place and we spent 3 hours making calls to water safety organizations who agreed to send instructors for demonstrations. We booked the pool for a Saturday afternoon and created a Facebook event that carefully avoided mentioning clothing or superstitions while focusing on water safety education and remembering loved ones. Paul helped us set up donation boxes for life jackets that would go to local families who couldn't afford them. The morning of the memorial, I got to the pool early to help set up tables and chairs around the shallow end. About 20 family members showed up, which was way more than I expected given how divided everyone had been. The lifeguards demonstrated proper rescue techniques while everyone watched from the deck wearing the bright orange life jackets we'd bought in bulk. Sienna read a list of water safety statistics that made several relatives nod thoughtfully. Jake brought photos of Greta, James, and Igor doing normal kid stuff like birthday parties and school plays, not just the death photos everyone usually focused on. People actually smiled looking at them and shared funny stories I'd never heard before. Nobody mentioned mentioned white clothes or dates or curses the entire afternoon. 2 days later, the mediator called saying Mom wanted to meet if I was willing. I drove to her office downtown where Mom was already waiting in the conference room looking smaller than I remembered. She kept twisting her wedding ring while the mediator explained the ground rules about respectful communication and active listening. Mom started by saying she'd been thinking about what I'd said, and maybe the clothing thing wasn't completely real, but she couldn't just turn off 40 years of believing it. The mediator helped us work through what that meant practically. Mom agreed to stop telling other people about the rule if I agreed to stop sending her articles about water safety statistics until she was ready. She also promised not to make comments about what anyone wore to family events. It wasn't everything I wanted, but seeing her admit even a tiny doubt felt huge. That Friday, Paul's girlfriend sent out an email about a family meeting to discuss safety protocols going forward. We met at the church basement since it was neutral territory, and about 15 relatives showed up with notebooks and pens. Paul's girlfriend had prepared an agenda on a whiteboard with real safety measures like designated sober supervisors at events with water and mandatory life jacket rules for kids under 12. People voted by raising hands, and every single safety measure passed unanimously. Mom didn't come, but grandmother mentioned she hadn't protested when told about it, which felt like progress. Someone suggested quarterly safety refresher emails, and everyone agreed. Monday morning, my boss called me into her office, which made my stomach drop until I saw her smiling. She said she'd been watching how I handled the family crisis while maintaining my work performance, and was impressed by my ability to stay professional under pressure. She'd approved a small raise effective immediately, and mentioned there might be leadership opportunities coming up if I was interested. I thanked her and managed to hold it together until I got back to my desk, where I let myself feel good about something for the first time in months. The raise wasn't huge, but it meant someone saw me handling this mess with some kind of grace. That weekend, I invited Paul, Amy, Jake, and Sienna over for dinner at my apartment. I made spaghetti and garlic bread, nothing fancy, and we ate while talking about movies and work and anything except family drama. Jake brought board games and we played until midnight, just laughing and being normal cousins for once. Amy mentioned how nice it was to hang out without the weight of family tragedy hanging over everything. Before they left, we agreed to do this monthly, taking turns hosting. Paul suggested we invite his girlfriend next time since she'd been so helpful with everything. Over the next few weeks, we kept up the dinners, rotating apartments and trying new recipes. Jake turned out to be an amazing cook and made us Korean BBQ one night. Sienna brought her new boyfriend, who fit right in with our weird little group. We made a group chat for planning that stayed drama-free and focused on food preferences and scheduling. Grandmother must have heard about these dinners because she sent me a card saying she was glad the younger generation was finding their own way forward. Mom never mentioned them directly, but I knew she knew. 3 months after the mediated meeting, Mom texted asking if we could meet for lunch, just the two of us. I picked a quiet restaurant downtown where we wouldn't run into family. She looked better than she had in months, with some color back in her face and steadier hands. She told me she'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma and survivor's guilt. The therapist was helping her separate her actual memories from the story she'd built around Greta's death. She didn't apologize for the hospital incident, but she did say she understood her fear had gotten out of control that day. She asked if we could have monthly coffee dates with clear boundaries about what we wouldn't discuss. I agreed, as long as we stayed away from clothing rules and water until she'd done more therapy work. She accepted immediately and even smiled a little. We set our first coffee date for the following week. 2 weeks later, grandmother called a family meeting at her house. Almost everyone came, even some relatives who'd been avoiding family events since Labor Day. She stood in her living room holding the same photo of Greta she'd sent me and announced it was time to retire the white clothing rule. She said it had served its purpose of keeping us vigilant, but now we had real safety measures in place. She didn't say the rule was wrong or made up, just that its time had passed. Most people looked relieved, though I heard Uncle Ted's brother mutter something about tempting fate. Grandmother asked everyone to focus on the future instead of the past. She wanted to see great-grandchildren learning to swim and families enjoying water safely. Meanwhile, Sienna and I had been taking swimming lessons twice a week for 3 months. We'd both started out terrible, but slowly improved to the point where we could do all 4 strokes without panicking. Our instructor mentioned we'd be good candidates for water safety instructor certification if we were interested. We signed up immediately, seeing it as the perfect way to honor Greta, James, and Igor. The certification course took 6 weeks of evening classes and pool time, but we both passed on the first try. The community center gave us Saturday afternoons for our classes, and we spent the whole week setting up flyers and posting on local Facebook groups. 12 people showed up for that first class, including Paul and his girlfriend, plus 2 other cousins who'd been quietly supportive. We started with basic floating techniques in the shallow end, while I watched everyone's nervous faces slowly relax as they realized we weren't going to push them into deep water right away. Sienna handled the paperwork and safety equipment checks while I demonstrated each skill, and we took turns walking around the pool edge, spotting anyone who looked uncomfortable. One older woman started crying halfway through when she managed to float on her back for 10 seconds, explaining she hadn't been in water since her grandson's accident 3 years ago. We extended the class by 30 minutes to give everyone extra practice time, and afterwards Paul helped us stack the kickboards and pool noodles in the storage closet. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom saying she was proud of us for teaching safety, though she didn't mention coming to watch. That same week, I noticed the family group chat name had changed from Family Emergency Alerts to Family News and Plans. When Amy posted a photo of her daughter's soccer game, people started sharing normal stuff again, like recipe links and birthday reminders, instead of constant weather warnings and reminders about clothing. Jake even posted a photo from his beach vacation where he was clearly wearing whiteboard shorts and nobody said anything about it. The chat felt lighter somehow, with actual conversations happening instead of just panic and rules. As August turned into September, I started getting nervous about the upcoming Labor Day weekend, even though my therapist had given me breathing exercises and coping strategies. The family planned another barbecue at grandmother's house, but this time the group chat showed real safety planning happening, with Paul volunteering to be the sober pool watcher and Ted arranging for temporary fencing. Nobody mentioned clothing colors at all in the dozens of messages about food assignments and arrival times. I picked out a floral sundress that had white flowers on it, testing myself and the family's progress. The morning of Labor Day, I drove to grandmother's house with my hands only slightly shaking on the steering wheel. The temporary fence was already up around the pool when I arrived, and Jake was setting up a table with life jackets in different sizes right by the gate. Kids were already running around wearing bright orange flotation devices over their clothes, and their parents were actually relaxed instead of hovering anxiously. Interesting conversation happening here. I wonder what they're really thinking. Paul waved from his chair by the pool where he had a whistle and rescue pole within reach, taking his safety role seriously. The food tables were set up far from any water water sources, and I noticed multiple adults had agreed to take shifts watching the pool area throughout the day. Mom arrived an hour later, giving me a small nod when she saw my dress but not commenting on it. She stayed mostly near the food tables, talking quietly with Aunt Paige, but I caught her glancing at me several times with something that looked like acceptance. More family arrived throughout the afternoon, and I realized nobody was doing clothing checks at all. People wore whatever they wanted, including Ted's nephew in a white polo shirt and Amy's daughter in a white sundress similar to mine. The conversation stayed focused on normal topics like work and school and upcoming vacations. Kids played in the pool with proper supervision, while adults rotated through safety duty without making it weird or obvious. Someone had even posted laminated safety rules by the gate and set up a buddy system for the younger kids. Around 3 o'clock, I walked past a group of relatives and heard them discussing vacation plans instead of warning each other about September water dangers. The whole atmosphere felt different from every family gathering I could remember, lighter and more relaxed even with all the safety measures in place. Grandmother sat in her usual chair watching everyone with a small smile, occasionally calling children over for hugs but not crying or bringing up the past. As the sun started setting, people naturally gathered in the main seating area, while Paul maintained his post by the now empty pool. Grandmother stood up slowly and suggested we share happy memories of Greta, James, and Igor, since we were all together. People actually smiled as they told stories about Greta's collection of butterfly drawings and how James used to make everyone laugh with his terrible jokes. Mom surprised everyone by sharing how Greta used to dance around the house wearing her butterfly wings from Halloween, spinning until she got dizzy and giggling the whole time. She cried while telling it, but she was smiling too, and Aunt Paige reached over to squeeze her hand. Even relatives who usually stayed quiet shared little memories about Igor's obsession with dinosaurs and how he used to roar at everyone. The stories went on for over an hour as the sky turned orange and pink, and nobody mentioned drowning or tragedy or clothing even once. That night after getting home, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom that made me sit down on my bed. She wrote that I was brave for breaking the cycle, and that therapy was helping her see things differently, ending with, "I love you," for the first time in months. I screenshot the message immediately and saved it in multiple places, knowing this wasn't a full apology, but recognizing it as real progress. The next morning, I pulled out my journal and spent 2 hours writing about how different this Labor Day felt from the chaos of last year. Our family had real safety measures now instead of superstitions, and people were starting to heal even if some relationships were still complicated. The journey had been awful and painful, and cost me relationships with some relatives who still believed in the curse, but sitting there writing, I felt genuinely happy about where we'd ended up. Thanks for hanging out and wondering about all these questions with me today. It's always interesting seeing where curiosity takes us. Until next time. And hey, like the video? It helps more than you think.